two of your chapter members have had books released, publication in the last month or two. The first one is another one in the series that Larry Milbury and Hugh Halliday have done over the years in the Aviation in Canada series. This one's on fighter pilots and observers, 1915 to 1939. And yours truly, I had a book released on Monday. It's a companion volume to the operational history of HMCS Labrador, which is the only icebreaker the Canadian Navy ever had until the new one gets commissioned next year. And my volume is about flight operations that took place from the ship, which were some of the very early pioneering helicopter operations in Canada, and certainly in the high Arctic where the ship operated from. So I'll just pass this around and give you an idea where the books are available and what they're about. So our speaker tonight is Ernst Cable. Ernie's not a stranger to the chapter. This is, by my count, the fourth time that he's presented here, and I think within the last 10 years, likely. And Ernie comes well equipped to talk about this subject, and certainly did justice to the previous aircraft that he talked about, and operations that he talked about in previous presentations. He's a retired colonel, formerly R.C.A.F. Squadron leader, and he was first involved with the CP-140 Aurora as the operational requirements manager in the Aurora program office, and later as the director of requirements. His Aurora operational roles in anti-submarine warfare included exchange duties with the U.S. Navy, Naval Air Development Center in Warminster, Pennsylvania, where he was responsible for software design and systems flight testing for the P-3C Orion update, and training the first U.S. Navy squadron to convert to the updated Orion. This was followed by assignments as the Aurora Operational Requirements Manager and later as Director of Requirements. In 1980, Ernie assumed command of 405 Squadron in Greenwood, where he led the squadron through the transition from the Argus to the Aurora. And prior to retirement in 1985, he also held several deputy chief and deputy commander assignments, and he is also the official historian of HMCS Shearwater. So Ernie's going to be talking to us tonight about the Consolidated PBY Catalina. So Ernie, welcome again.
Thanks, Don, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me when I wander away from the mics? Okay, good. The presentation that I'm about to give you this evening, I actually prepared for the Shearwater Centennial celebrations that were held in August of this year. That's at Shearwater that Don talked about, previously R.C.A.F. Station Dartmouth during the war. And they asked me, as part of the centennial celebrations, they held a historical workshop, and they asked various people to make presentations on aircraft that had flown out of Shearwater, alias R.C.A.F. Station Dartmouth, from its history from 1918 to the current time. So they asked me if I would speak about the Canso, which spent a fair amount of time officially based at Dartmouth, but spent more time on detachment elsewhere in the North Atlantic. I was glad to be able to do this because one of the Canso squadrons that flew out of Dartmouth during the war was 162 Squadron, which was my dad's squadron. And my dad was the warrant officer in charge of maintenance from the time that the squadron formed in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia in 1942 until it disbanded in Sydney, Nova Scotia after the war in 1945. Now, the presentation that I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to talk about the evolution of the Canso and how it was used by the Canadian Air Force during the Second World War, and some of its achievements, and how the Canso achieved some of its fame. Now, the Canso was an American-built airplane, and the Americans at the time that the Canso was being built, actually it wasn't called a Canso, it was called a Catalina, but it was PBY. And the Americans' way of designating aircraft were by a series of letters and numerals. And PB stood for Patrol Bomber, that's what the Catalina, as it became known. And then Y identified the company that built the aircraft. And Y was the designator for Consolidated Aircraft. So we say, well, how did it get its Catalina name? Well, it got its when the British became interested in the Catalina, and following British tradition, they didn't go by numbers like the Americans. They gave all their aircraft names. And so they called the PBY a Catalina. And it's interesting how it got that name, because it doesn't have any kind of British connection. But the Catalina was a rugged airplane. It could withstand a lot of damage. The crews admired it. They loved flying it. It was known for its reliability, although it had some vulnerabilities. But it was a rugged airplane, and it was well respected by the crews that flew it. As a matter of fact, the crews from 20 countries around the world flew the Catalina through its lifetime. In total, there were 3,431 Catalinas built in the United States and Canada, and the Catalina was the most widely produced flying boat during the Second World War. As I mentioned, it was flown by 20 countries around the world. It served in the Atlantic and Pacific and Far East theaters, where it won its fame. Unfortunately, being a maritime airplane, it did its thing over the distant seas, away out of the view of the public. And its achievements were overshadowed by operations that were closer to home. For example, people know a lot more about the Lancaster than they do the Catalina. So as I said, it served in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Far East theaters, and we'll talk a little more about that later. Now, it wasn't until the Canadians became involved that the name Canso came to the fore. The Canadians followed the British example, saying, well, we want to name our airplane, and we want to give it a Canadian name. So they named it after the Straits of Canso, the body of water, the straits between mainland Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. So it became known as the Canso. And the name Canso gets confused with Catalina. Some people think, erroneously, that a Canso is simply a Catalina with an undercarriage. Well, that's not the case. Any Catalina that was ordered by Canada and flown by the R.C.A.F. was a Canso. The Canso the version of the Canso that had an undercarriage was called a Canso A. A for amphibian. And it served on Canada's Atlantic and Pacific coast throughout the Second World War. In fact, it was the unsung guardian of our coastlines during the Second World War. Now, during the Battle of the Atlantic, the Catalina and Canso's tremendous range and endurance allowed them to patrol vast ocean expanses to protect Allied convoys carrying war materials and food supplies to Europe from marauding German U-boats. Although slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters, the Catalina earned its place in history by locating enemy capital ships and invasion fleets. These major naval these critical sightings were instrumental in turning the tide in the favor of the Allies during major naval campaigns in the Second World War. In May 1941, an R.A.F. Catalina located the German battleship Bismarck, which had eluded its British pursuers in the mid-Atlantic. Bismarck's reported position enabled the Royal Navy to re-engage and sink one of Germany's most powerful warships, and gave a disheartened British nation a much-needed boost in morale. In April 1942, while deployed to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, an R.C.A.F. 413 Squadron Catalina, flown by Squadron Leader Birchall, reported the Japanese fleet approaching Ceylon before being shot down by Japanese fighters. The sighting warned the island's defenses and resulted in the survival of the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, and the Japanese failure to capture the strategic island of Ceylon. Prime Minister Churchill later dubbed Birchall, who survived the remainder of the war in a series of Japanese war camps, dubbed him the savior of Ceylon. In June 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina spotted the Japanese carrier force approaching to attack the strategic American base on Midway Island in the Pacific. The advanced warning enabled the U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet to cripple the Japanese fleet by sinking 4 of their aircraft carriers, and signaled the turning point in the war in the Pacific. It's kind of a shame in a way, although well-deserved. Birchall was indeed the savior of Ceylon, but he was better known for having looked after his men in the Japanese prisoner of war camps. He underwent tremendous torture and just in horrible, abominable conditions, but he stood up for his men. He took many, many beatings because he told the Japanese that the men in his camp were not going to go to work camps. And the Japanese beat him. At one time, they threatened to poke out his eyes with a white-hot sword, and they said, "No, you aren't worthy of having your eyes gouged out. We've got better things for you." So, although he was the savior of Ceylon, he was awarded the DFC for that. But he was awarded the OBE for his work as the senior officer in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Back to the Catalina. It was designed and built by Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, which established itself as a supplier of naval patrol flying boats, initially established in Buffalo, New York in 1923. The corporation required an ice-free location to conduct year-round flying boat operations. In 1935, established a massive manufacturing plant in San Diego, California. Now, the predecessor to the Catalina was this airplane, also built by Consolidated, and it was the best that the U.S. Navy had at the time, but it suffered from some design deficiencies. It was a biplane, 2 engines, and it doesn't show up very well in this picture here, but the lower wing is here, and these are the floats that kept it stable while it was waterborne. Notice the massive struts and wires that hold the upper wing in place. Also, it has 2 tails, which are also supported by a massive struts and wire, all of which create drag and, of course, reduce fuel efficiency and range. It had a 2-step hull. Now, in October 1933, now I'm going to talk about the XP-3Y. Now, I don't have a picture of the XP-3Y. The best I could do was to get a picture of a Canso. But I wanted to show you in this photograph some of the features that the Catalina inherited that made it a vast improvement over the previous P2Y. In 1933, while still located in Buffalo, New York, Consolidated received an order from the U.S. Navy to build an experimental patrol craft, which the Navy designated XP-3Y1. Consolidated referred to the aircraft by its Model 28 civilian designation to differentiate the design from U.S. Navy requirements. The Model 28 and its follow-on versions became the most extensively built flying boat in aviation history. Powered by two 825 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial engines mounted on the wing leading edge, the Model 28 was an all-metal monoplane, although the flying controls were made of fabric. Featuring a parasol wing mounted on a pylon housing the flight engineer's position on top of the hull. The new wing design introduced internal bracing, which resulted in a virtual cantilever wing, which was a breakthrough in aircraft design at the time. Requiring the support from only two aerodynamically streamlined struts on each side of the hull between the waterline and the wing center section. The new design eliminated the multiplicity of drag-producing struts and bracing wires that had limited the performance of earlier flying boat designs. Another innovation was to improve the aerodynamic efficiency was the float retraction system. The floats suspended under each outer wing for stability on the water could be hydraulically retracted outward in flight to become streamlined wingtips. This remained the trademark of all Catalinas. The Model 28 had a two-step hull design similar to the earlier P2Y flying boat, but replaced the twin tails, braced with wires and struts, with a singular cruciform cantilever tail structure. The wing and the tail section were not true cantilevers, but it was the precursor to the cantilever wing, which meant that the wing could basically support itself. Just 7 days after the first flight, on 21 March 1935, the XP-3Y1 was flown from Buffalo, New York, to Norfolk, Virginia, for U.S. Navy service trials, which confirmed a significant improvement over flying boats in service. In October 1935, while in Norfolk, the XP-3Y1 embarked on a spectacular pair of test flights. The first flew from Norfolk, Virginia, to the U.S. Naval Air Station in Coco Solo, Panama, non-stop. Then as an encore from Coco Solo to San Francisco Bay, California, again, non-stop. The XP-3Y1, having flown a distance of 3,281 statute miles, established an impressive new international record for seaplanes. Its extended range and improved carrying led the U.S. Navy to request further development to qualify the experimental XP-3Y1 as a patrol bomber. The XP-3Y1 returned to the factory in October 1935 to be fitted with upgraded 900 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. Consolidated also redesigned the vertical tail surfaces, which resolved the problem of the tail becoming submerged on takeoff under some conditions. Following the U.S. Navy's nomenclature for designating types of aircraft, the updated aircraft was then designated XPBY1, the X indicating that the design was still experimental. The PB, of course, stood for patrol bomber, and Y designated the consolidated builder. Impressed by the obvious potential of the XP-3Y1, the U.S. Navy ordered 60 production aircraft designated the PBY1 in June 1935. 16 months later, VP-11F was the first squadron to receive the PBY1. In 1937, the U.S. Navy ordered a further 50 PBY2 aircraft that incorporated minor improvements over the PBY1. Similarly, in November 1936, the U.S. Navy ordered another 66 aircraft with upgraded engines, known as the PBY-3. In May 1938, the first of 33 PBY-4s were delivered with the sliding hatches replaced by a new waist perspex blisters, which became the trademark of all subsequent PBYs. The blisters enclosed the waist gunner's positions and afforded a panoramic view of the sea on overwater patrols. Each blister housed a 50 caliber machine gun. One 30 caliber machine gun was mounted in the nose turret, and another was mounted in the ventral tunnel facing aft. Don't know whether you noticed, but just behind the last step in the hull, where the tail sweeps up, that was called the ventral tunnel, and that gun that was put there was to defend against aircraft that were attacking from astern and below. In April 1939, the last of the 33 aircraft off the PBY-4 production line was returned to the factory to be converted to an amphibian by installing a retractable tricycle undercarriage. The two main wheels were fitted with oleo shock absorbers and retracted into wells on each side of the fuselage. The nose wheel retracted into what was automatically, the nose wheel retracted into a well that was automatically enclosed by doors when the nose wheel was raised. All three wheels were extended or retracted by a hydraulic system which was powered by the main engines or an auxiliary power unit. On completion of the amphibian modification in November 1939, the modified PBY-4 was designated an XPBY-5A, with the A indicating the amphibian version. Although its increased versatility and because of its increased versatility and the outstanding contracts for 33 PBY flying boats were modified to incorporate a retractable landing gear and completed as PBY-5As. Additionally, another 134 PBY-5As were ordered, with deliveries commencing in December 1941. To meet the continuing demand for flying boats, PBY-4s were upgraded to the same configuration as the PBY-5As, but with no undercarriage, and were designated PBY-5s. Consolidated continued to build PBY-5s in parallel with PBY-5As, both of which featured an uprated 1,050 horsepower engine and provisions for extra self-sealing fuel tanks. Contracts were placed in 1941 and 1942 for 586 PBY-5 flying boats and a further 627 PBY-5A amphibians. Also, a further 225 PBY-5B flying boats, the designation for PBY-5s destined for the Royal Air Force, were ordered under the American-British Lend-Lease program. Air crews were uniformly positive about the flying qualities of the PBY-5 and PBY-5A. With the increase in horsepower and refinements in the hull design, the handling characteristics of later versions improved noticeably. A successful takeoff involved in getting the hull up on the step by adjusting the trim according to the aircraft's center of gravity and simply flying the aircraft out of the water. The accepted landing technique was a power-on approach with a flat glide landing, then holding the aircraft on the step and flying as close to the mooring buoy as possible. Taxiing into wind was easy as long as the sea did not wash over the windshield, obscuring vision and drenching the pilots. However, taxiing in a crosswind was another matter. The technique was to frequently full throttle one engine while keeping high power settings on the other. To secure the aircraft to a mooring buoy, a crew member in the bow would snag a buoy with a boat hook, then quickly tie the line and snub the buoy as close as possible to the aircraft. The British Air Ministry purchased a single Consolidated Model 28 flying boat for evaluation in 1938. Flown across the Atlantic, the aircraft was allocated to the Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment at Felixstowe, Suffolk, in July 1939. The outbreak of the Second World War terminated the trials early, but with little doubt of the excellence of the design, the first batch of 50 aircraft was ordered under the designation Catalina Mark I. Initial deliveries of the R.A.F. Catalinas began early in 1941 and subsequently equipped 9 Coastal Command squadrons, including the R.C.A.F's 413 and 422 squadrons, as well as 12 squadrons serving overseas. In total, the RAF received 701 flying boats and 12 amphibians. The RAF Catalinas were ferried from the Consolidated factory in San Diego to the UK via Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and Bermuda, then a long 20-hour transatlantic flight to Greenock or Prestwick on the west coast of Scotland. The RAF Catalinas were initially painted a disruptive brown and green camouflage pattern on the upper surfaces in sky. It looks like light green to me, but it's known as sky, underneath. The brown on the upper surfaces was replaced with sea gray in 1942. Later in 1942, a radical change was made when all the undersurfaces, hull sides, and vertical tail were painted matte white to make the aircraft less visible when viewed against the overcast skies that were common over the Atlantic. The upper surfaces of the wing and horizontal tail retained their gray and green camouflage color, so the aircraft blended in with the sea when viewed from aircraft above. There we go. There, this was the original paint scheme in the green gray color. This is the revised color. Notice how they maintain the gray green on the upper surface of the wings and the horizontal tail surfaces. The rest of the aircraft was painted matte white. Just behind the fuselage was also the gray green color. A large number of Cansos, Catalinas and Canso flying boats and Canso A's were built in Canada, and deliveries were divided between the R.C.A.F. and the U.S. Navy. Under an agreement between the U.S. and Canadian governments in 1941, Canadian Vickers of Montreal, now Bombardier, and Boeing Aircraft of Canada in Vancouver began production of the PBY-5A. Canadian Vickers delivered their first PBY-5A on the 3rd of April 1943, and by the time the production ceased in May 1945, 369 aircraft had been produced. Of these, 139 went to the R.C.A.F. and 230 went to the United States Army Air Force for search and rescue, mainly in the Pacific, as they were fighting a war in the Pacific. They had long overwater flights. Boeing built 240 Catalina flying boats, designated PB-2B1s and PB-2B2s, entirely for Lend-Lease. Most were delivered to Britain as Catalina 4s and 41 to New Zealand. Boeing also produced 17 Canso flying boats and 55 Canso 8s for the R.C.A.F. The Canadian-built aircraft were powered by two 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines and carried a crew of 9. Armament consisted carried a Vickers K gun mounted in the nose, and there were twin guns mounted in each of the blisters. And initially there was the in the tunnel leading up to the tail, and it was later taken away because it wasn't used very much. But notice underneath the wings was where the anti-submarine weapons were carried. Notice that the Canso could only carry 4, which turned out to be a limitation. And when the war first broke out, these weapons were depth charges. They were 450-pound depth charges. However, as the war progressed, the homing torpedo was developed. And it was very, very top secret, hush-hush at the time, and it was disguised as a Mark 12 mine. So when the aircraft was uploaded, it looked like it had 4 depth charges, but really, in the final analysis, it had 3 depth charges and a Mark 12 mine. The Royal Navy, the R.A.F., and their Commonwealth partners began to achieve greater success in encountering the U-boat in the Eastern Atlantic in the spring of 1941. The U-boats concentrated their attacks on convoys west of 35 degrees west longitude, which is roughly where the divide in the book here. So the U-boats were gradually, because they were not doing too well, so they moved to a more benign region in the western half of the Atlantic. Since the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, the R.C.A.F. had been lobbying the R.A.F. and the Americans for a share of the Catalina patrol bombers coming off American production lines with sufficient range to counter the expected U-boat threat off Canadian harbors and to escort convoys in the Western Atlantic. But since the U-boat had yet to present a serious threat in the Western Atlantic, the RAF and the Americans had higher priorities for the Catalinas, and the RCF had to make do with their shorter-range Supermarine Stranders, Douglas Bigby's, and Lockheed Hudsons. On 20 May 1941, convoy HX-126 this convoy here. The convoys were all had names that indicated where they were coming from. And HX was a Halifax convoy, and it was convoy number 126 coming out of Halifax. The convoys, some of the convoys would form up in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and then make their way down to Sydney. Other convoys formed in Halifax's harbour, just outside of Dartmouth, and then they would make their, this would be the, if you had to draw one line that indicated the convoy route, these were the convoy routes to the UK, where they were carrying war materials and food and supplies. Anyways, convoy HX-126 was heavily attacked 680 miles east of Newfoundland. The R.C.A.F. pressed again for immediate delivery of Catalinas. The plea was strengthened by the fact that a number of these aircraft were lying idle in the United States and Bermuda, waiting to be ferried across the Atlantic. The next day, bearings on a German radio transmission placed a U-boat at 55 degrees north, 50 west. So, the HFDF bearings from along the Canadian coast here pinpointed that there was a D-boat, or there's a U-boat rather, in this area here. However, it was on the fringe range of number 10 Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron Digby's in Gander, Newfoundland. Now I'm going to switch terminology here. When people ask my dad what squadron he was in, he would say 162BR. Other people would say, or other people outside the Canso community would say they were from 5 Squadron or 10 Squadron or whatever. But the Bomber Reconnaissance Squadrons considered themselves as a special breed. So they said when they asked them what squadron they were from, if it was a Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron, they dropped the word squadron and said they were from 10BR, 162BR, what have you. The R.C.A.F. made the point that Catalinas with an effective range of 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers could have made a thorough search of the area. On the 24th of May, the Air Ministry in London informed R.C.A.F. authorities that 9 Catalinas on order for the RAF were being diverted from Bermuda to the R.C.A.F.'s Eastern Air Command headquarters in Halifax. Just to bring your people up to speed here, the R.C.A.F. at that time was not functionally oriented as it is today. It was geographically oriented, so that anything that was east of the Ontario-Quebec border was administered by Eastern Air Command, whether they be fighters, bomber reconnaissance aircraft, transport aircraft, search and rescue aircraft, what have you. They were all administered from Eastern Air Command headquarters here in Halifax. The aircraft were being lent, subject to replacement from the first delivery of Catalinas from the R.C.A.F.'s own orders. Also on 24 May, the R.C.A.F.'s need for a longer-range coastal patrol aircraft was underscored when the German battleship Bismarck and the cruiser Prince Eugen broke contact with shadowing Royal Navy cruisers in the Denmark Straits, located just west of Iceland. Number 10 BR's Douglas Digby's searched for the Prince Eugen, which had split away from Bismarck by continuing south and posing a threat to convoys in the Western Atlantic, well beyond the range of the Digby's based in Newfoundland. The 9 lone Catalinas were promptly delivered to 5BR at R.C.A.F. Station Dartmouth in June 41. Having already sent personnel to Bermuda for training on Catalinas, 5BR crews were well advanced in converting to the Catalinas by the end of the month. The squadron was considerably shaken, however, by orders to transfer its most experienced personnel and all Catalinas to 116BR, a new squadron forming at R.C.A.F. Station Dartmouth. The lone Catalinas took off and landed from their moorings on the water at Eastern Passage. This is the marine side of R.C.A.F. Station Dartmouth. The airfield is up here, and this is Eastern Passage. Now, Eastern Passage is called Eastern Passage because the harbor entrance at Halifax. In the middle of the harbor entrance, there are two islands, Lawler Island and McNabb's Island. And the water between McNabb's Island and the Dartmouth side, the east side, was called Eastern Passage. And the water to the west of McNabb's Island and the city of Halifax itself was the main passage. So this is a portion of the Eastern Passage here, and these are the two seaplane hangars that we'll see more of later. This was an administrative building. And like the R.C.A.F Station Trenton, there's a highway ran through the middle of the base. Servicing, including refueling and arming, was conducted from barges that were towed alongside the Catalinas at their moorings. For servicing and repairs that could not be performed at their moorings, maintenance crews wearing hip waders fitted beaching gear to the hull and towed the aircraft up the concrete ramp in front of Y hangar. By the end of July, 162BR had dispatched a detachment of 4 Catalinas to the seaplane station at Botwood, Newfoundland, where it carried out the important task of escorting UK-bound convoys through the Straits of Belle Isle. In the meantime, 5BR reactivated its Stranraer biplane flying boats at Dartmouth. This is one of the British Catalinas that was diverted from the R.A.F. order, and this is the beaching gear. What happened? There's a concrete ramp that ran down to the water. These guys had put on hip waders that came up to their armpits, weighed out onto the water, attached the beaching gear to the aircraft, tail wheel back here, and then with a tractor they would tow the aircraft up to the up the ramp to do work on it that couldn't be done while at the moorings. You can tell it's a British aircraft by the serial numbers. In October 1941, 5BR was the first R.C.A.F squadron to receive the first PBY flying boats from Canadian orders in the United States. The Canso greatly extended the range and endurance beyond the vulnerable Stranraer on convoy escort and anti-submarine patrols. By December 1941, small numbers of Canso A aircraft, the amphibious version of the Canso flying boat, were becoming available off both American and Canadian production lines. And by the end of February 1942, 13 Canso A's were on 5BR strength. The Canso A's operated from the Dartmouth airfield and conducted anti-submarine convoy and escort patrols south of Nova Scotia, particularly for the transatlantic convoys on the triangle run segments between New York, Halifax, and Sydney, Nova Scotia. The squadron also deployed detachments of the seaplane to the seaplane station at Gaspé, Quebec, to escort convoys in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and to Sydney to escort transatlantic convoys south of the Cape Breton Island and Newfoundland. This is the triangle run, flown by aircraft out of Yarmouth and Dartmouth and Sydney. This is a seaplane station up on the Gaspé Peninsula that the aircraft deployed to do convoy patrols in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. So convoys, some of them would originate in New York and come straight across, and of course convoys coming the other way. They would come, and they required escort. Halifax was a major seaport. Sydney was a major seaport, and I think that we saw in some of the previous slides that the convoys came out of Sydney and joined the Halifax convoys en route to the UK. In the summer of 1942, the Canso A's were fitted with the British ASV Mark II radar with 2 sets of telltale Yagi antennae. The first set was mounted on struts on either side of the fuselage after the cockpit, while the second set was suspended mid-span on struts under each wing. The Mark II radar could detect surface vessels out to 36 miles and 6 miles against the surface U-boat. The R.C.A.F. anticipated performance gains similar to R.A.F. Coastal Command, where radar had produced a 20% increase in daytime attacks on U-boats. However, because of the sea clutter, the Mark II radar suffered from a 1-mile blind radius around the aircraft, making nocturnal blind attacks all but impossible. I've circled the radar antennas here. These are the fuselage mounted on. There are 4 dipoles that transmitted the radar energy, and this was the receiving antenna. Now these radar antennas looked out to the side of the aircraft. They couldn't see forward. So it mounted on the wing, and you can see it here on this Canso here. Doesn't show up well. Here are the struts, and then here's the Yagi antenna that looks forward. And then here, as you see, a smaller antenna, which is the transmitter, which looks forward. So basically what happened most of the time, because their best radar were the fuselage-mounted antennas, that's where they made most of their detections. Once the detection was made out to the side, they'd turn the aircraft towards the target and using the wing-mounted antennas to home and engage the target. Like most radars today, even today we have the problem. You can have a ship or a submarine on radar, and you can only get so close before you start getting radar returns from the sea that form a blind donut around the aircraft. So basically what you do is you do a timed run. You know what your airspeed is, you know you're traveling at 200 yards a second, so you time yourself from your current position where you go blind to the center of the donut where the target is. This is a close-up of the fuselage-mounted antennas. Again. These are the 4 dipoles that actually transmitted the energy, and this is the Yagi antenna that picked up the radar returns, and the radars were monitored by the wireless air gunners in this portion of the aircraft. In November 1942, winter conditions at the Botwood Newfoundland Seaplane Station forced 116BR Cansos to temporarily return to Dartmouth, while their seaplane base was established at Shelburne, Nova Scotia. Shelburne is about halfway. It was an auxiliary naval base where the Navy kept a lot of their destroyers and corvettes, where there wasn't room in Halifax Harbor. And so it was planned to make it also a seaplane station. But early icing of the Shelburne Harbor prohibited flying boat operations, and when 116BR permanently relocated to Dartmouth using the moorings on Eastern Passage. At the same time, 10BR's aging Digby's in Gander were no longer reliable for sustained long-range operations, and the squadron was withdrawn to Dartmouth. The anti-submarine forces in Newfoundland were brought up to strength by transferring Dartmouth's 5BR Canso A's to Gander, along with a small detachment of Canso A's from the still incomplete 162BR at Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The Canso A's extended endurance allowed Eastern Air Command aircraft to range closer to the German U-boats in mid-Atlantic operating areas. Under the direction of Squadron Leader Wally Small, the 162BR detachment commander, 5BR extended the range of their Canso A's beyond their normal 500 miles by stripping excess weight from the aircraft, including extra guns, ammunition, and stores. In all, about 1,200 pounds, 450 kilograms, was removed, which permitted the Canso A's to operate out to 700 miles from base. The move to Gander was fortuitous for 5BR, as the squadron went on to conduct 17 U-boat attacks on 25 sightings, resulting in 2 successes. With the ability to make a series of promising attacks at maximum range, the Canso A's became the backbone of Eastern Air Command's bomber reconnaissance squadrons. However, the RCF would have to wait until the arrival of the very long-range B-24 Liberators to close the mid-Atlantic gap between Iceland and Newfoundland, where U-boats operated with impunity beyond the range of land-based air cover. Early in the war, there were no RCF personnel experienced in maritime air operations, and coordination with the Navy was non-existent. So the neophyte Eastern Air Command Squadron crews had to learn through the painful process of trial and error. In 1942, officers from the R.A.F. Coastal Command visited Eastern Air Command in Halifax to brief crews on their British Coastal Command operations and the offensive tactics used by the R.A.F. to push the U-boats back 350 miles from Coastal Command bases. Eastern Air Command's performance slowly improved by adapting Coastal Command procedures, including copying Coastal Command's all-matte white paint scheme to make the aircraft less visible to U-boat lookouts. Patrol altitudes were increased from 1,000 to 3,000 feet, a more effective height for visually detecting surface U-boats. The RCF also ventured into operational analysis, which indicated that most of Eastern Air Command's patrols were flown within 200 miles of base, thereby failing to strike the U-boats before they had reached the convoy focal areas closer to the harbor approaches, where they inflicted the most damage. Eastern Air Command also abandoned the practice of attempting to escort every convoy without regard for the U-boat threat, and concentrated on protecting those convoys where intelligence reported a high probability of encountering a shadowing U-boat or a wolf pack positioned to intercept convoys. Wolf pack. The Germans knew that they had to get from Halifax to the UK, and they, at some point in time, they had to cross that Great Circle route. Mind you, there were many of them. So the German U-boat command formed what they call wolf packs, which would be a fleet of about 15 to 20 submarines spaced across the potential convoy routes at about 15 to 20 mile spacings, waiting to, hopefully, one of them would intercept the convoy. When one of them detected a convoy, it would call in the others, and then it was a feeding frenzy. And that's why at the beginning of the war, we lost so much shipping to the enemy U-boats. The Canso's endurance and longer patrols over the convoys provided better continuity for convoy protection that consisted of sweeps along parallel tracks, 50 miles on either side of the convoy's mean line of advance, as well as searches 50 miles astern and 10 and 100 miles ahead. Coastal Command's successes against the U-boat improved through closer cooperation with the Royal Navy, which provided intelligence largely derived from high-frequency direction finding, or HFDF bearings, on U-boat transmissions. For whatever reason, the German U-boat commanders were required to report to their headquarters, and much more frequently than what we would thought would have been normal, but they did, and it was a boon to the Allied anti-submarine forces because they exposed their positions. Following the British example, Eastern Air Command's successes against the U-boats started to improve as Canadian HFDF capabilities advanced dramatically. The Royal Canadian Navy's Operational Intelligence Center in Ottawa, using the HFDF organization developed in cooperation with the Department of Transport and the R.C.A.F., had become one of the two U-boat plotting centers for the Western Atlantic. Washington, D.C. was the second center. Initially, HFDF information arrived at Eastern Air Command Operations Center in Halifax by teletype signal, but often too late to be of operational value. Therefore, a new system of passing HFDF information by commercial telephone using code words enabled Eastern Air Command to react to the most recent HFDF bearings by repositioning patrols to high probability areas. In fact, Squadron Leader Small, who was an ardent enthusiast of naval intelligence, maintained one of his squadron's aircraft on immediate alert to respond to hot HFDF bearings. Until early 1943, Eastern Air Command crews abandoned U-boat searches on losing contact, but Coastal Command aircraft persisted in their searches for about 6 hours and achieved second sightings about 25% of the time. British studies concluded that a U-boat attempting to escape quickly was likely to surface and present a good visual or radar contact. Or if it remained submerged at a nominal speed of 2 knots, a U-boat's furthest on circle after 2 days would be no more than 100 miles from the last known position. Coastal Command therefore developed a hunt-to-exhaustion search tactic where 4 aircraft on task at a time continuously searched the contact datum for 48 hours. Eastern Air Command also adopted hunts to exhaustion, codenamed Salmons. These could only be carried out once a U-boat had been sighted. Good intelligence was the key to making the initial contact, and usually depended on the operational intelligence center signals transmitted to Eastern Air Command. Otter signals contained the submarine's tracking room's forecast of the areas where U-boats would probably be found the next day. The predicted locations were based on fresh intelligence, a sighting, an attack on shipping, accurate HFDF bearings, or German signals decrypted by Bletchley Park in England. Again, the Canso's endurance enabled longer on-task times during salmon searches, providing better search continuity and higher probability of regaining contact. "162BR was the last of the 5 Canso A bomber squadrons to operate from R.C.A.F. Station Dartmouth during the Second World War. 162 formed at Yarmouth in 1942 to provide anti-submarine and convoy escort patrols between the American eastern seaboard and Nova Scotia. But as the U-boat Pockenschlag or drumbeat offensive moved further south to attack the South American tanker routes supplying oil to the United States, the U-boat presence south of West Nova Scotia diminished. Therefore, 162BR moved to Dartmouth to cover the target-rich approaches of Halifax's strategic harbor. Notwithstanding that 6 of the squadron's 15 aircraft were deployed to the United States Army Air Force Base at Stephenville, Newfoundland, 162's 9 remaining Canso A's made a low-level arrival flypast over their new base on the 3rd of October, 1943. You just can't stop airmen from beating up airfields. 2 days later, all available aircraft and crews were ordered to Goose Bay, Labrador, to counter a reinvigorated U-boat offensive in the Western Atlantic, returning to Dartmouth only for major servicing. At the end of November, 162 finally returned to Dartmouth, but their Canso A's had to operate from the water Eastern Passage as there was no room on the airfield. This is a painting by a well-known aviation artist, Jeff Bennett. Unfortunately, he just passed away several months ago. But this is a Canso taking off from Eastern Passage. This is McNabb's Island in the background. Dartmouth Air Base is over here. The aircraft's taking off. You can see its armament load here, and the radar antennas out on the wings, out on the side. Wheels retracted for takeoff, and it's just coming up on the step, just ready to get airborne. Ask me later on why Mary Kay, and 9754 was one of the most famous Cansos, and we can talk about that later.
Great view of the depth charges too.
Mm-hmm.
Great
Yeah.
view of the depth charges too.
Yes. Only 1 month after returning to Dartmouth from Goose Bay, 162BR was ordered to RAF Station Reykjavik, Iceland, an airfield commandeered by the British in 1941. The airfield's strategic North Atlantic location enabled RAF and American aircraft to patrol the convoy routes between Greenland and the United Kingdom. Anti-submarine forces at Reykjavik consisted of a very successful Coastal Command Very Long-Range Liberator Squadron and 1 Hudson Squadron, plus 1 U.S. Navy Ventura Squadron. Neither of the latter 2 aircraft had sufficient range to cover the convoys on the Arctic routes or to reach the U-boats as they slipped through the Iceland-UK gap into the North Atlantic. To bolster their long-range capability, Coastal Command requested a Canso squadron from the R.C.A.F., resulting in 162 Squadron being ordered to Reykjavik. It was agreed that the squadron would remain under the administrative control of Eastern Air Command, but under the Coastal Command's operational control. I point that out, the administrative control and operational control, very important. When I was a commander, this is something that commanders talked about at length before I would deploy one of my squadrons to another squad, to another area under the jurisdiction of another operational authority. Administrative control basically says you are in charge of providing the people, for feeding them, for their paying them, their leave, their medical, everything to do with administration. Operational control is, here's what I want you to do and when I want you to do it. So it was incumbent on the R.C.A.F. to provide the resources, and for the R.A.F. Coastal Command to say, here's what I want you to, here's what I want to do with those resources. Make sure they're trained to do the job. After a frenzy of activity to give their Canso wings a thorough overhaul, 162BR departed Dartmouth on 1 January 1944, New Year's Day. The aircraft were brought ashore and towed up on the airfield to avoid the possibility of frozen breaks from a water takeoff. The journey from Dartmouth to Reykjavik, Iceland was made in 3 stages via Goose Bay, Louis West 1, and Green Line. The 15 aircraft were loaded with the maximum weight with 60 ground crew, personal kit, and spare parts. Knowing that there were no Cansos in Reykjavik, spares from Canada were essential. Dakotas and Liberators flew the remainder of the ground crew to Reykjavik. 2 modest R.C.A.F. coastal freighters, Eskimo and Beaver, from the R.C.A.F. Dartmouth Marine Squadron, made the perilous voyage unescorted through U-boat infested rough seas to deliver 162BR's heavy equipment to Reykjavik. The move was the first by an R.C.A.F. squadron using solely R.C.A.F. resources. During the first 3 months of 1944, 162BR was part of Coastal Command's offensive in the western approaches to defeat the U-boat wolf packs attempting to strike convoys en route to the United Kingdom. It was during this offensive that the squadron made its first contact with the enemy on 22 February 1944, when Canso 9841 attacked a surface U-boat through heavy flak. Despite good placement of the depth charges, the U-boat was not seriously damaged, and the subsequent hunt to exhaustion yielded no results. This is the Eskimo, and its sister ship Beaver. They weren't called, the R.C.A.F. numbered all of their boats. The Marine Squadron at Dartmouth had over 80 vessels. The Eskimo and the Beaver were the 2 largest vessels. As you can see, they're small coastal freighters. Why did the R.C.A.F. need small coastal freighters?
Radar sites.
Radar sites, exactly. At the time, as part of their preparations for war, the R.C.A.F. Eastern Air Command built a series of radar sites along the south shore of Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, Newfoundland, up the east coast of Newfoundland, and into Labrador. The majority of those radar sites were only accessible by boat, and these are the boats that were used to transport the building materials to build the bases on these remote locations. This is the 162 squadron hangar in Reykjavik. It could only hold 2 or 3 aircraft. They had a total of 15. You can see this is the type of heavy equipment that had to be transported by ship. And they had to build nose docks because the hangar could only house so many people. And I don't know whether anyone's ever been to Iceland, but the winds there are horrendous. And so have the ground crews work out in the wind. They had to be protected by these nose docks. Also, you can't arm an aircraft in a hangar because of the danger and blowing up the hangar plus all the other aircraft in it. So the aircraft are armed while they're up at these nose docks that were basically used to break the wind. These are Nissen huts, which were all over the base at Reykjavik. It's where the men lived, ate, slept. Everything was a Nissen hut of one kind or another. This particular one probably provided maintenance equipment to deal with the aircraft. This is how they loaded the depth charges. There was a man up on top of the wing with a hand winch, passed a cable down through the wing, and then that was attached to the depth charges, and it was winched up to the wing station. And they'd winch up the next one, go over to the other side, and do that. That's a good view of the wing-mounted radar transmitter, the actual Yagi antennas further on the wing. The other thing to notice here is look at the landscape. Not a single tree. Not a single tree. When I first landed at Keflavik, which is just down the road from Reykjavik, as we landed and we returned off the runway onto the taxiway, we taxied past the Icelandic National Forest, which was a little fir tree about 2 feet tall. The squadron's first victory came on 17 April 1944, when Canso 9767 attacked U-342 west of Iceland. The nose gunner silenced to return fire, allowing the Canso to drop 3 depth charges from 50 feet in a perfect straddle of the U-boat's hull. The U-boat circled, settling lower in the water. The Canso circled, firing from the blister positions. Eventually, the pressure hull collapsed from the initial attack, and U-342 sank. Now, what is interesting here, notice what the U-boat is doing. Okay, it's obviously sighted the aircraft sighted the U-boat. The ideal attack, when you're attacking a submarine, is to come across the U-boat's course, as mean line of advance, at about a 30-degree angle, because it was easy to judge the placement of the depth charges. It was easy to line up. But if you attack from the side, there's a good chance that the depth charges may not straddle the hull. So in order to complicate the firing solution, the U-boat captains started circling. Initially, when they first were sighted by aircraft, they would crash dive. It was suicide because they just set up the aircraft nicely for a 30-degree attack. Okay, and the U-boats were gradually losing the war. This is what the attack looked like by Flying Officer Cook flying Canso 9767 as he attacked 342. This is taken from the camera mounted in the tail of the Canso. Here you can see the first depth charges. Okay, now you can see the plume here, and it actually porpoised, skipped, because the aircraft was too low. The ideal height for dropping a depth charge was about 100 feet. Cook was at 50 feet, okay? So it was similar to like when you skip a stone across the water, okay? So this depth charge porpoised, but it landed shortly on the far side. This is the second depth charge hitting the water. This is the third depth charge on its way in. This is the next photo in the sequence. You can see that the second depth charge has just entered the water, and the third depth charge is still on its way in. The last photograph here, the plume from the explosion of the first depth charge is just starting to rise. The plume from the second depth charge is just starting to plume, and this is the third depth charge as it entered the water. And this is when the plume is at its full height. The plume from the second depth charge is just starting to rise, and the third one is just starting its rise. The idea is to straddle the submarine with 2 depth charges and crush the hull. And of course, there's always the sad side. That's the crew from 342. During May and June 1944, Coastal Command launched an Arctic offensive in the waters off Norway to counter probable U-boat breakout from ports in Norway and Germany to interfere with the forthcoming D-Day invasions across the English Channel. Because the Canso's amphibious capability, 16BR was advised that it would probably be required to move rapidly and work under difficult conditions. Between 23 and 25 May 1944, the first 162BR detachment arrived in Wick, Scotland, a Coastal Command airfield on the North Sea and the entrance to the northern transit area to the English Channel. And by the end of June, all of the squadron's aircraft were flying from Wick. What the concern was here is that the Germans had submarine bases in Norway, which are still occupied, and obviously submarine bases in Germany coming up through the Skagerrak. And what they wanted to prevent was submarines entering, this was called the U-boat transit route, coming in through the North Sea and interfering with the D-Day invasion. Remember, this is what I say this was in early to mid-May. The D-Day invasion was on the 6th of June, 1944, down here. So they had to block the U-boats up. And so 162 deployed from Wick, Scotland here, and they flew their patrols in this area here. On the 24th of June, 1944, Flight Lieutenant Dave Hornell's attack on U-1225 brought the squadron its greatest fame. U-1225 was sighted on the surface about 120 miles north of the Shetlands. Canso 9754, remember we talked about it earlier, turned for the attack and encountered intense accurate fire, which knocked out the starboard engine and started a fire in the starboard wing. Hornell held on violently, held the violently vibrating aircraft steady for a successful depth charge attack, but the starboard engine then fell off the wing, and he had to ditch the aircraft only a few miles from the sinking 1225. As the crew abandoned the flaming wreck, one of the two dinghies overinflated and burst, leaving only one four-man dinghy for all 8 men. 2 crew members at a time took turns in the water, but after several hours, everybody squeezed on board with limbs trailing over the side. After 21 hours in the frigid water, a rescue launch finally arrived, but 2 crew members had died from exposure, and Hornell was in the last stages of exhaustion and could not be revived. For his determined, skillful attack in the face of withering enemy fire and selfless conduct after ditching, Hornell was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first to be awarded to a member of the R.C.A.F. Hornell's 5 surviving crew members were also decorated. What is interesting here, the artist, this is by Graham Wagg, another well-known aviation artist. They've captured the U-boat in its circular route, trying to complicate the attack. First depth charge in here, second depth charge in here, and this is the third one here. Why isn't there a fourth one? The fourth one was a Mark 12 mine. The 162 crews weren't allowed to drop homing torpedoes on a surfaced U-boat. There was concern that the U-boat could be recovered and then reverse engineered, and then the U-boats could figure out how to evade the torpedo. So that's why in the previous attack on 342, you only saw 3 torpedoes. Likewise, in Hornell's case, there's only 3 torpedoes. One of the remaining torpedo, the remaining depth charge wasn't a depth charge. It was a Mark 12 mine or homing torpedo, which was very top secret, and they weren't going to give the secrets away by attacking a surface U-boat. A lot of the Canso's difficulties were in attacking submarine. Was that the U-boats were equipped with quadruple anti-aircraft guns on the aft side of the conning tower, which were deadly, and so they had to counter that by beefing up the nose armament on the Canso. And this was remember we started off with we talked earlier that there was just a single machine gun in the nose. Okay, what they did next They mounted 4 machine guns down here. There's 2 here, 2 here. And then they mounted this, what they call the eyeball turret in the nose. So now you had 6 guns. So that kind of evened the battle up a little bit and gave the Cansos attacking the U-boats a fighting chance, because they had a viable nose armament. Before, they were literally unarmed. June was a remarkable month for 162BR. Of the 8 U-boats destroyed in the northern transit area, 162BR claimed 4 and shared in a 5th, at a cost of 3 downed aircraft, 13 aircrew dead, and 1 taken prisoner. Coastal Command senior officers were most impressed and attributed 162BR's success to the excellent training and determination plus bags of guts. Coastal Command stated that if they had really good intelligence, we'll put 162 right in the middle. On the 6th of August, 162BR's large detachment at Wick returned to Iceland to strengthen the coverage of the western approaches and the northern transit area. By the end of the summer of 1944, the exciting and dangerous work of attacking U-boats was coming to an end. The mundane escort duties, no less vital to defeat the U-boats, would go on without pause. According to German records, Catalina and Canso aircraft sank 38 U-boats, second only to the B-24 Liberator for the number of U-boats sunk by aircraft. Another important but intangible measure is the number of ships that sailed but were not sunk, because of the inestimable number of undetected U-boats that were deterred from their attack by the visual presence of aircraft, thereby allowing the critical cargoes to reach their destination. All of the R.C.A.F. Second World War Canso squadrons were disbanded in the summer of 1944. In the late 1940s, 408 and 413 photographic squadrons were formed to support the aerial mapping of northern Ontario. Among other types of squadrons, among other types of aircraft, the squadrons were equipped with Cansos for photographic support work and resupplying the remote survey sites. The Canso's last call to duty in the R.C.A.F. occurred in the early 1950s, when the Cansos formed the backbone of 4 search and rescue flights across Canada. 121 flight in Sea Island, British Columbia, 111 flight in Winnipeg, 102 flight in Trenton, Ontario, and 103 flight in Greenwood, Nova Scotia. The last Canso was struck off R.C.A.F. strength in 1962. End of my mission. That's the story of the Canso and one of the squadrons that